Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure working with you. We have known each other for a while and have been friends. It's great to be here this morning with you all on this nice fall Friday morning in Atlanta. And when Earl and Bruce Kennedy had asked me to introduce David Brown this morning, I said, wow, that'd be great. I've listened to David for a number of years and enjoyed the work that you do. But I also said, well, you know what? This will be light duty on a Friday. Everybody knows David Brown. What do I have to say about him? So I said, this will be really easy. I did run into some of his classmates this morning. David is a native of Fayetteville. So I found out some things I didn't know about David. But I'll share those for another day. As you all know, David is the host of Marketplace and a joy to listen to every day on WABE. Hey, and what you may not know, and I found pretty interesting, is that David's into motorcycles, and he's a real Renaissance man. He loves history and a wide variety of different topics, and he's been described as a journalist. He's very curious. He likes researching and digging for new things and learning new things, and I really appreciated learning that. He's one of public radio's most highly respected and broadly experienced hosts and journalists, and you all know that just from listening to him. Just as a brief background, David's been working in broadcasting for some 20 years, and started in 1989. I think started before that, but in 1989 he served as executive producer of CalNet, the California Public Radio News Network, and then served as Washington bureau chief and chief national correspondent for Monitor Radio and Monitor Television, as Monitor Radio's London correspondent, and then as program producer of Monitor Radio's Daily Edition. From there, believe it or not, I didn't know this about you, David. David left Monitor Radio to pursue a degree in law. So he's a lawyer. And I thought that this was really interesting. One of the reasons I understand was to kind of be able to unpack the spin on some of the information we get as journalists, which comes in handy, I would imagine. When Brown graduated from law school in 2000, he joined the staff of Marketplace as a producer, and then several years later as host. So I'm excited to hear what he has to say this morning, and I hope that you are too. Without further ado, David Brown of Marketplace.
I'll tell you, it is good to be home. It really is. I mean, the folks here are just so warm. I do want to thank you for your warm welcome, and I wish I had a hair tie. It is a real pleasure to be back here and to meet people who have a passion about business and about Atlanta and about public radio's role. Public radio is a particularly useful way to connect to the rest of the world, and I'm going to try to take you behind the scenes in just a moment. Doing Marketplace is a lot different from, how it was when I delivered my first newscast on a real radio station right here in Atlanta in 1981. It wasn't too far from here, actually. It was the 1400 block of Peachtree Street. It was the studios of a station called, and some of you may remember this, WLTA. Remember that? They played Gone with the Wind at the top of the hour. And the rest of the time, they played Barbra Streisand and Neil Diamond and the Lawrence Welk Singers. And today, that station's a little different. It's called 99X. They don't play Lawrence Welk anymore. When I first began in this business, public service was required of commercial radio stations. We did a 6-minute newscast every hour, and our Sunday mornings were full of public affairs shows. But deregulation changed everything. You remember, this was the start of the Reagan era. One day, I received a call from a colleague at the station who told me that you better get down here. The news staff is being fired. Well, everyone, it turned out, but me. I was making $3.35 an hour, the minimum wage at the time, and the station could keep me on and maintain the appearance of having someone doing news. They were still figuring out if deregulation allowed them to cut out the news altogether and just run more commercials. Well, not too long after that, I wound up at the flagship station of CNN Radio, which I gather is now a sports station in town. And that was then an all-news operation. And by the end of the 80s, I was a European correspondent for Monitor Radio on American Public Radio. In London, that was really the first time I heard people talk about globalization. Among academics, really, in particular, there was this idea that the world was about to crack wide open. There'd be opportunities for development in underdeveloped places. You know, so many people, when I would talk to them, thought about this as a giant step forward. I mean, this was toward a world that many people had talked about, dreamt about, since the end of the Second World War. You remember the European Union came together in, 1948 or so, really, and wasn't realized until fairly recently. But at the time, I was covering mostly political events and not economics. In the early 90s, I was interviewing the U.S. trade representative in Washington when I first began to understand globalization in a completely different way. The USTR explained to me that with the fall of the Soviet Union, which appeared imminent at the time, barriers would come crashing down. And it was her job to ensure that American businesses were poised for the windfall. That's when I realized three things in the course of that conversation. First of all, Washington saw globalization as the spoils of winning a Cold War. That was number one. Number two, that this would be an attempt to export American-style free market capitalism. That was another major goal of the administration. And the argument really was something that still echoes today. You give other people a financial stake and it would promote stability. We've heard that a lot recently. And third, that Washington was about to embark on a kind of promotional campaign for American business. It was really the likes of which we had never seen before. The government was arranging junkets around the world for American business leaders, really becoming sort of the biggest chamber of commerce on the planet. That's what it was. Now, you mentioned I ride motorcycles, and so this story I find particularly, close to my heart and illustrative of how much things have changed, how much things had changed, really, by the early 1990s. Let me take you back to the middle of the last century. In the early 1950s, Harley-Davidson sold big bikes. They still do, but I'm talking about big bikes. But so many soldiers returning home from Europe after World War II had ridden those quick little bikes from England, right? Well, when the British manufacturer Triumph came stateside in the early 50s, Harley just could not compete with those big motorcycles. So Harley begged for tariffs to be imposed to protect them from those sporty little British bikes that all the old servicemen wanted. This was the Eisenhower era, however. Washington dragged its feet for the longest time, claiming that this was the free market in operation. Harley should not be protected from those forces. Well, finally, Congress was talked into imposing import taxes on European motorcycles just long enough for Harley to develop a smaller American-made bike. They still make it today. It's called the Sportster. Ultimately, the tariffs were lifted. By the 1990s, Washington wanted it both ways. They wanted to convince emerging nations not to tamper with the free market, to let the best products win. But in fact, Washington was pushing American-made exports as never before. Now, other governments aren't stupid. They noticed this. They didn't want America simply selling to them. They wanted a piece of that action. Globalization is supposed to work for everybody, right? That's what you're telling us. Well, eventually, there would be a series of compromises. Anyone remember NAFTA? Well, several months ago, on its 10th anniversary, our program, Marketplace, looked back at what had happened. In the early 1990s, Ross Perot warned of a giant sucking sound from south of the border as American jobs disappeared. And we, a giant sucking sound. Well, he was almost right. The jobs did not move south, our report discovered. They moved across the Pacific. You know, outsourcing is such a buzzword today, but it didn't happen overnight. It happened over the course of more than 10 years of global trade liberalization, world trade talks. Frankly, it happened while America was undergoing a revolution in personal finance. It happened while the mom-and-pop investor discovered the stock market, when Ameritrade and E-Trade and these online trading services started coming online. The meteoric rise of the dot-coms, a vast accumulation of middle-class wealth. In other words, it happened when most of America wasn't looking and when all was right with the world. Let me take another example of something in the news. In President Bush's first term, I'm talking about Bush, the younger, not the elder. The American steel industry found it couldn't compete with steel produced overseas. And against every tenet of free trade, which is what the GOP stands for, the Bush administration imposed steel tariffs. Now, the Europeans balked. They demanded that America drop those tariffs so they'd take their complaint to the World Trade Organization. The U.S. sheepishly dropped the tariffs before taking it all the way to the WTO, but they declared victory. They said they'd been in place long enough to give the U.S. steel industry a breather. This was protectionism. But the Europeans, and this is something I think a lot of Americans don't fully appreciate, and something that our correspondent in London has tried to hammer home to us, that emboldened the Europeans like never before. They upped their complaints against Washington's tax breaks for certain U.S. exporters. Now, mind you, we call these tax breaks, right? Well, they call them illegal subsidies. The WTO agreed. And so they gave Europe the green light to ratchet up punishing tariffs on a wide range of U.S. products, from California wine to, what do you know, Harley-Davidson motorcycles. What goes around comes around, I suppose. Well, the tariffs got so high that Washington had to do something, and in September, Congress finally removed those offending tax breaks, but not without giving a whole set of new tax breaks to companies that make tackle boxes, bows and arrows, handheld folding fans. In fact, if you go through all 600 pages of tax breaks, I believe some people have called it the No Lobbyist Left Behind Act. This is not what Washington's global trade advocates imagined only 15 years ago. This isn't it. That's because there is a certain disjunction between the ideology of free trade, which we've been trying to sell abroad, and the politics of free trade. And honestly, I don't know how we're going to square that. I just do a radio program. I don't know. But I have a hunch that the Bush administration is happy to see the dollar weakening right now. It makes U.S. goods more competitive abroad. The problem is we're not making a lot of things in this country anymore. The other day I had the opportunity to chat with Sir Harold Evans. He's the former editor of the Times of London, and he's written several books, one of them, The American Century, which is a fabulous book if you haven't seen it, and more recently a terrific book which has been turned into a PBS television series called They Made America, which is fabulous if you haven't seen it. Well, we were talking about innovation, and I asked him, since he was British, what was it that compelled him to write a story about American innovation, right? And he said something fascinating. He said, you know, a long time ago when I was a science writer back in the 50s in London, I discovered that we, the British, invented the jet engine. We, the British, invented radar. I'd heard that. We, the British, pioneered the electronic computer. It was part of our code work during World War II. But we couldn't capitalize on it. It took American companies like Pan Am to create the jet age, IBM to create the computer in every office and then on every desktop, and Raytheon to take that radar technology and make it something that you could actually make money with. Americans have always been better at making inventions relevant, practical, useful. In short, they're great at democratizing the benefits of invention. Americans are good deal closers. But the 21st century, he said, offers the greatest challenge to American supremacy in innovation. And man, that sort of blew my hair back. I got a lot of hair to blow back. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, because in the future, we may not be able to close so many deals. Places like India and Indonesia are making massive investments, not just in factories, but in their people, in education, in math, in sciences, in language. Meanwhile, back in the States, we're buying Game Boys made in China. 2/3 of our economy is the consumer. Our governments struggle with deficits. Healthcare has become a huge burden for American businesses, and government has little flexibility to do anything about it. And so I ask you, where are the Pan Ams and the IBMs and the Raytheons of tomorrow? At Marketplace, we're trying to report these stories. The sun comes up and there's something new to add to the narrative. Let me explain what I mean by narrative. Every day really is a wild ride at my shop. It begins at about 5:30 in the morning, Pacific time. I read the papers, I check the news wires, I listen to the BBC and NPR, and roll into the studios in L.A. at about 7 o'clock in the morning. And then we can read some more papers and look at the wires. And then at about 8, our staff gets together around a big table, a big oval table in a place we call the war room. It has clocks all over the wall and big erasable boards. Everyone comes in with ideas, and a producer takes notes at one of the huge boards. And we narrow down the stories that we think that we need to cover, and then we go our separate ways to do our different tasks. The greatest part of my day is involved with the narrative. It's reading business reports, talking with analysts, digesting numbers, and trying to make sense of it all in a kind of broader context. And there's seldom even enough time to break for lunch. All day, the producer and the foreign editor and the domestic editors and the production assistants are running in and out of each other's offices with updates on how stories are developing and what reporters in the field are telling them, and I'm usually writing or interviewing someone in the studio. Each of us has a task, and for me, it's that narrative I was mentioning, and I'm trying to match it up with the stories that we're getting that day from our bureaus, and we're working against the clock, and there's a kind of barely contained team insanity that goes on there. By about 1:45, I read through my script with a producer, and we do what's called an oral edit. She's playing the role of the listener and stopping me. No, that verb should be plural. No, I don't understand what you're saying. Try again. And at about 1:55, the director literally takes the script out of my hands with my scribbled corrections and makes 4 copies, and I go into the studio to do mic checks. There's a main talk studio. It's like a hub with 4 different control rooms. I dim the lights. I have one overhead spotlight which illuminates a big felt-covered desk with microphones sprouting out of it. There are a couple of computer screens in front of me. One that'll show me where we are in the program. The other gives me the real-time bulletins and the Reuters news wires. When the opening music comes on, I rise to my feet and I hold the script out just so, and I begin to perform it, the stuff that I've spent all day writing. And so I'm literally acting my script with big gestures to put emphasis in my voice. It's similar to what you see in newsreels of the old radio programs. There literally is a red on-air light that comes on at 2 in the afternoon, and the director raises her arm and drops her finger, and there you are on the air with millions of people. And yet I'm really uncomfortable talking to a small room like this. But there's something here, really, I think is underappreciated by those millions of listeners, and I'd like to share this with you. I'm just the host of the program. The program doesn't belong to me. If it belongs to anyone, it's that imaginary person in the room at our morning editorial meeting around that big oval table in the war room. It's the person we're thinking about as we plan the show and craft the segments and choose what to include and what to leave out. It's the person that I imagine I'm talking to when the red light comes on, and I am thinking about a single person. About 25 years ago, when I was a cub reporter here in Atlanta, I used to marvel at how my boss, the news director at WLTA, put together his newscasts. And one day I mustered enough courage to ask him, how do you pick out what you're going to talk about? And he told me something that I use to this day. He said, I try to imagine that I'm having a conversation with a couple of very good friends, and the time is short, and I care about these people. And so I think, what can I tell them that will be of the most importance to them? What do they need to know to help them understand what's going on right now? Don't think about the lead story, the sensational item. Don't think about what the other guy is going to lead his newscast with. If you think about the listener first, the rest falls into place. Now, he's a much older guy now. After commercial news disappeared and deregulation, he went another direction. But I'm here to tell you that the practitioners of public radio, the names that you seldom hear except in the credits, but whose work you hear every day, they are the last of a breed. This is a breed that started before deregulation. The Murrow folks, those people, those kinds of ideals. Your presence here, your affiliation with WABE, says a lot about your own dedication to that spirit that takes it for granted that the listener comes first. And so from Los Angeles, I bring a warm and sincere round of thank yous from my colleagues. And on behalf of WABE, gratitude for your investment in Atlanta and its communities. And I'm happy to take any of your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, David. We are opening the floor for questions. If anyone has questions, please feel free. Is there? Okay. Oh, yeah.
David, on the tariff issue, commodities like sugar used to be protected. Are they still protected in the United States?
You know, I'm not sure if sugar is protected. I know that we still do have a couple of protective tariffs that are still out there, and in fact, Congress has been challenged on this. I know that Congress has been trying to revamp these protective tariffs and come up with new ways to characterize them so that they'll pass WTO muster. I'm not sure that protective tariffs on sugar, though, are in place. I couldn't tell you for certain, though. I'm sorry.
You were talking about innovations and the U.S.'s ability to be the innovations we're examined with IBM. So that we're the IBMs of tomorrow. We hope it's the IBM will be the IBM of tomorrow. However, but that's not the question. But in fact, Wayne Clough of Georgia Tech and Sam Palmisano, our chairman of IBM, are working literally right now on the Innovations Initiative to try to create the sense of urgency in the U.S. regarding developing the talent pipeline. Mm-hmm. What is it that you think that we can begin to use as that clarion call that really helps the folks in the U.S. to understand how important it is to build the talent timber, and not that it's other people's problems, but that we have the opportunity here to grow our own?
You know, this gets at something that I feel pretty passionately about, I have to be honest with you. There are new business partnerships that are starting up to encourage whether business education partnerships, but something that I think is lacking is an ability for business to communicate to educational leaders that the quality of the education, that is to say the coursework that you're actually teaching at these schools, is worth improving. And there are some new initiatives that are being started, but I don't think that they've really gained ground. The onus, unfortunately, I mean, for better or for worse, really will be on business. I don't believe that there is tremendous popular support for changing curriculum in our schools. If anything, there's been a kind of dumbing down trend. You know, we've seen everything from standardized tests changed so that more people can pass. We've also seen sort of a strange backlash with the attempt to hold public schools accountable. You know, there's a kind of education for the test instead of an education for our next generation of leaders. In the early 1960s, the space program had a very had a palliative effect on education. The space program, with all the astronauts and everything, had a lot of kids wondering, how can I be an astronaut? And so that meant a lot of them were learning maths and sciences. We don't really have that right now. We don't have really anything that matches that. The closest thing we had, and we noticed this in some surveys that we did in the mid-'90s, there were a lot of people who cited Bill Gates as a hero. Take that for what it's worth. But I'm not sure that it comes anywhere close to developing the kinds of liberal arts skills and the science skills that we need to develop a new generation of innovators. I hope business will think creatively about how to communicate to the educators of today to create the leaders of tomorrow.
Great, thanks.
Right there in the back.
David, what's your take on Walmart? That was a very interesting program the other night.
You like that?
Yeah, it was quite interesting.
Yeah, Hedrick Smith did a special for Frontline, and it was a joint effort with Marketplace. If you missed it, it was about America as a Walmart nation. In fact, later today I plan to have a few remarks about that. Walmart is an economy within an economy. I was interested to learn that if Walmart were a nation, it would be among China's 10th biggest trading partners. Now here's something that I think is really underappreciated. Some of you may have done business with Walmart. I honestly don't know. But Walmart demands transparency from its suppliers. And by transparency, I mean they want to know everything about that company. They want to know where their profits are coming from, how much those profits are, how much their costs are. And so when you meet with Walmart to say, hey, we've got this great American product we'd like to sell, and we know that you're from Bentonville, and we know that you want to buy American, so here's our product. What they'll do is they'll say, well, guys, see that you're making a little too much profit here, and your costs are a little high here. And they say, well, but guys, we're buying American. We're trying to, do the right thing. Yeah, but, you could lower your costs if you went to China. And you can still kind of assemble it here in America maybe or something. We're not worried about that too much. And that's what's happening. They're looking at, they're demanding that manufacturers be transparent, demanding that they take certain steps which ultimately leads to the export of U.S. jobs. And given Walmart's size, remember we had this huge Sears Kmart takeover just this week. They're not close. Home Depot is number 2, based here in Atlanta. They're not close either. My big fear about the Walmart economy is that what we will see, I'm afraid, in about 5 to 6 years is Sears Holdings, which is actually Kmart taking over Sears. What we'll see with Sears Holdings is the dismantling of a couple of great businesses. We're going to lose them. And it's almost inevitable. I mean, if you talk to economists and you ask them about outsourcing, what they will tell you is that this is inevitable. Get used to it, And it's very difficult. You don't hear a lot of really, really good ideas about how to fight this trend. I will point to one thing, though, that's kind of encouraging. Michael Dell of Dell Computer is personally, as a CEO, he's committed to trying to do something about outsourcing. He's built plants in his home state of Texas. He's built a plant in Tennessee. He's built a plant, most recently announced that he's going to build a plant in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. That's huge. I mean, that's the kind of spirit that we need to see from America's companies. We're not seeing a lot of it. One final thing I will say on this score. Overseas, they recognize that there's about to be a tremendous backlash here in the United States. We don't see it coming. They do. You can make Mercedes-Benz SUVs in Europe. You don't have to go to Alabama for that. You can make Honda Goldwings in Japan without making them in Marysville, Ohio. You can do a lot of this stuff. They are getting ready for the huge outsourcing debate, the likes of which we have not yet seen. And they're trying to put themselves in a position of strength. I do believe that at the very least we're headed toward having to deal with the loss of manufacturing and the conversion of America's economy into such an overwhelming consumer economy. Most people don't understand that yet, I don't think. Low prices.
The outsourcing and the offshoring, as it's sometimes called, there is obviously many people that have an inherent resistance to it.
Sure.
And let's take the other tack. How could we capitalize on it? Who's doing some good thinking about how can we capitalize on it and make the globalization of the economy work for us in the long run as we are maybe...
The United States at the moment doesn't have the flexibility to make because we're running up tremendous deficits, right? That's part of the deficit issue, by the way. I mean, we worry about bonds and we worry about the dollar and that sort of thing. I think there are two things. In the short term, the falling dollar is going to help us. These are sort of interconnected here. The falling dollar is going to help U.S. manufacturers, those that are still here. In the longer term, however, I believe that if there is to be a future for American manufacturing, it will be a future for American manufacturing jobs led by foreign interests, outsiders. And so what we can do to bring jobs to the United States is to create an environment that is conducive to that. Make schools where people will want to have their kids, grow up. Make cities that work. Reduce crime, those sorts of things. Those kinds of infrastructural investments which will make America more attractive to foreign companies coming into the United States. But in terms of the great American manufacturers, I'm not sure that much is going to change. Eventually, we may see, and I'm talking 50 years down the line now, we may see that as environmental regulations and as workplace regulations improve across the globe, that the advantage for producing, say, in China or in some of the Asian tiger nations will disappear evaporate, and America will hopefully still be left as a very large consumer marketplace, and it'll make sense, just as much sense to do business in the United States as it does other places. I don't know. That's a pretty optimistic outlook, though.
David, what do you see occurring with the U.S. tax code next year? We hear on the one hand it's just to turn the current tax reductions permanent, and then we hear sort of in the background that the John Linder fair tax is being seen as a serious item where the income tax and the corporate tax may be abolished, and in would come this sales tax.
Right.
But I'm not really hearing anything in the media to say whether one is serious and or whether it's just simply pie in the sky.
Well, I had a conversation with our I see there we go. I'm going to give it up. Had a conversation with our Washington bureau chief about this just a couple of days ago, and what struck me was that on the one hand we've been hearing talk about making the tax cuts permanent, the earlier tax cuts that the Bush administration pushed through permanent, and how this was going to drive the deficit up to like $3 trillion or something over, 10, 15 years. I forget the actual way that breaks down. And yet, the Bush administration, as you rightly point out, has been talking about revamping the tax code, completely revisiting it. Flat tax, VAT, the value-added tax, similar to what the UK has, for example. And if that's the case, thank you very much. If that's the case, then this stuff about we're going to, this stuff about we're going to keep the tax cuts permanent, no, that's not true. That's not true. And so all the doom and gloom scenarios you're hearing about the budget deficit, I think that's a little hyped up, to be honest. Now, on the value-added tax, something that, in fact, I read from Donald Radachek, one of your economists here in Atlanta, he pointed out a very interesting thing, that with the value-added tax, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, what it basically means is there's a tax on every transaction that you make when you're a shopper. That one of the big ideas would be if you fell below the poverty line, you might actually get a check from the government, the way that a lot of people get rebate checks today. With the value-added tax, if you were to try to raise the value-added tax to compensate for the loss of revenue with the loss of the tax program as it is, that tax would have to be 23%. That's a lot of money. 23% added onto the price of your goods, right? But at the same time, we all get raises. Ta-da, right? Because we're not paying Social Security. I mean, we're not paying, and we will be paying Social Security, but we're not going to be paying those federal income taxes. Well, he was pointing out that he believed that once you factored in, he believed that the estimates were actually pretty low in terms of what this would do to transactions. He actually thought that this would increase in GDP terms the amount of money that the United States would bring in and help offset the deficit. So that's what the Bush administration is thinking of. But the second tier of this is that since you don't have a value-added tax on foreign transactions, this actually helps U.S. businesses that are trying to compete abroad. And that might actually stimulate our economy as well. So there's a good side to this whole value-added tax thing as well. I think it's going to be very, very hard, though, to wean businesses off of tax breaks. I can't imagine how that debate's going to play out. I mean, you think about the favorite tax break of all for consumers or for homeowners is that mortgage tax break. And I don't see how that's going to disappear. They're going to have to do something about that. But as it stands, and this is what my colleague in Washington told me, as it stands, he genuinely believes that people in the Bush administration they're actually looking at a whole buffet of ideas and trying to figure out which is going to work. The transition is going to be expensive any way you cut it. But he has made this one of his top 3 agenda items, and I think we may very well see it within the next 4 years.
Going back to the outsourcing issue a moment, if we may, in Georgia they have the saying there's 2 Georgias, Atlanta and the rest of. And given the U.S. and the export of jobs, manufacturing jobs, do you see 2 Americas, the educated America in software and new innovative technologies, and then the kind of the ones left behind that did the manufacturing. And what do you think would be the outlook on that in a few years?
In the short term, yes. Remember, we're not entirely unaccustomed to what's happened here. I mean, you remember, I guess it was about 15, 20 years ago, there's a lot of concern about the Rust Belt states. And we don't really talk about Rust Belt states anymore. We remember them, we know what they are, but there's been a real change. Some of that's demographic. Some of that is people who have actually gone into retirement and who are relying on Social Security or pensions, what's left of them. But I don't think it's going to be, I don't think what you're describing, this two America concept, I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think we're already seeing the haves and have-nots growing. And the stuff about retraining, I would love to believe that that was a viable option. I don't see it happening. I don't know about you guys. I don't see that retraining happening. I actually see a lot of poor folks who don't have the skills. And this actually exacerbates the problem for American businesses trying to succeed because they just don't have a good talent pool to pull from. So again, a long-term thing. I don't see the Bush administration making this a number one item on its agenda. It has its hands full. I mean, in all honesty, there are three things that I think President Bush, the day after or the day after, I guess it would have been the 5th or something, 4th. Anyway, he said that he was very clear, I thought, on where this was going to go. He wanted to do something about tax reform. He wanted to do something about Social Security. And he wanted to balance the deficit, which is a mystery. I mean, I don't know how we're going to get there to the balanced. I just don't have any idea. Nobody seems to, and there are no good figures. But nowhere did he talk about health care. I will say this, more and more, the more business leaders I talk with, the more I hear the concern about the health crisis in this country. This has gone from being a mom-and-pop issue to being a business issue in a very, very big way. And I think it's going to achieve critical mass by 2008. I wouldn't be surprised if this doesn't become a major GOP issue, one that's just going to knock Karl Rove upside the head because they're not going to have a real good way to deal with that. I don't hear a good solution, but I believe, though, ultimately, because business, you can deal with liability issues, but that really is not going to deal with some of the larger, more fundamental issues. I think that this is going to be on the agenda right around 2008. That'd be my short answer for you. I don't see it happening within the next 4 years.
David, in your war room, do you ever talk about Sarbanes-Oxley, and how do you translate that for the listener?
Oh, boy. Yes, usually you don't say Sarbanes-Oxley without saying Enron. Sarbanes-Oxley was, it was designed to institute a wide range of corporate reforms, for those of you who know. And in fact, I think a deadline just passed on Monday for making sure that you've got all your records straight for the public. It is hard to make that useful to the listener. I have to confess something to you. Marketplace, we have a name, Marketplace, and it sounds like the Lou Dobbs, business report. And we're not. I mean, here's a little secret. Little secret is that, we have this thing, now let's do the numbers. Well, if you want numbers, radio is a terrible place to get your numbers. It really is. I mean, you get them in the newspaper or something. Don't go to radio for the numbers. And it started out as a joke. It was a way to sort of say to people, look, the numbers are not what business is about. Business is about people. That's what this program is about. When CBS tried to do a business program before Marketplace did, all they were numbers. And they had about 500 listeners, and that's about it. And afterwards, public radio stations said, we don't want a business nobody's listening to the business program, right? And so when Marketplace got started, the idea was, no, focus on the human stories that are behind this, Sarbanes-Oxley, when I think of Sarbanes-Oxley, I try to think about the people who were hurt by the collapses of Enron and WorldCom and those sorts of things and tell the stories there. I have to tell you this, though. This is an example, and it doesn't strike directly at Sarbanes-Oxley, which I think actually is necessary. I mean, we had to have some kind of reforms. Maybe it didn't go far enough. After Enron collapsed, there was a lot of hand-wringing about how the media missed this huge story. And so we ended up talking with the secretary who worked at Enron. And we were asking her, did she notice anything strange around there? And she said, oh, no, it was just, in fact, I had a lot of pride in working there at our Houston offices. It was people were just jazzed. They were excited to come into work in the morning. It was just fun. Well, give us an example of a typical day. And she said, a typical day? Well, I'll tell you the day that I remember. One day, Kenneth Lay and some others came down to our floor. They were on like the third floor. And there was all of this hullabaloo. And I asked, what's going on? And they said, well, we're having the people from S&P's, the rating agency, come in and evaluate our condition, our financial health, so that, evaluate our debt, give us a debt rating. And so we had to move our chairs around, and we had to set up some TV screens, and we set up a whole bank of plasma screen TVs, and then we set up a bunch of telephones. And then we had all these guys come in from the 7th floor, and they sat behind these phones, and they told us to go off in the back and start calling these telephones. They were setting up a movie set to impress the ratings agencies. Now, how do we find this out? We talked with a secretary. Now, in the run-up to Enron's collapse, who would have asked a secretary, what's going on at Enron? You talk to the CEO and get him on CNBC, of course, and he tells you all of the stuff that's in the annual report. That's how we missed Enron. Business is always about the people. And I don't mean whistleblowers. I'm not talking about people who want to cause a problem. She thought her bosses were heroes, right? Just talk to people. And so and this is not a very good answer to your question. What I'm trying to say is when we try to report on something like Sarbanes-Oxley, we try to find the people who were hurt when it didn't happen, when it wasn't there, That's what we try to do. And I think it's become a kind of signature of the marketplace style.
We'll probably have time for one more question.
Just maybe a little shift in relating to U.S. manufacturing and another Atlanta company, GE Power, is headquartered here. And there's a great deal of talk that there may be, for the first time in a quarter century, a resurgence in the U.S. nuclear power industry. New sites, new construction. Maybe Yucca Mountain will get resolved. You have any thoughts about that at all?
Well, I think it's accurate. I think we are seeing a resurgence in it. I think that if you look at the stock market, you're seeing that companies that are involved in nuclear energy and in alternative energy, you're seeing it. And nuclear energy has become lumped, or is, at least psychologically in the business world, it's becoming lumped with alternative energy sources. Ironically enough, it's part of the clean fuel initiative. I think that what we're going to see is a move toward these sorts of energies, toward nuclear energy, as the United States tries to wean itself off of oil, off of coal. And I have not yet heard the backlash, which is interesting. I don't know if anyone else has, but I have. You remember Yankee Power when they built that up in New England? There were protests out. I actually think it is what's going to happen. I think it's really going to explode very soon. I don't mean that. I think it's really going to mushroom. Oops. You know what I'm saying.
Okay.
It is a great part of pride is a balls and within air is ingredients is or prox stand with just just bring numbers try and fix the midst of attending all kind in a broader context and understand there well enough in time for break lunch all the play will seduce and or inforter editor and the casters editor production and instructions just running the run out into the beach office we sit up and have sort of institute of users being all and what refers in the field of impelling and actually you write a writer here also you in this one and duty each has a staff it's that of American shows me and I'm action match with up to the story getting rid of that marble from road. Here we're working against the there's and kind of prayer and can really gain 10 into the and goes that on there. About 54155 I remind through risk I put with Sir Duty and what's we do when called her for she's at the play of rocks let's turn I mean that no people no what you're still saying I try and at about 55 to read the lecture literally to take grips my out of hand I sort of scribbles correct and for next copy goes in this one to go to my doom next shit the main business talk on duty like a slab before to confront over Trump's own I over one of them head like options which it's when I felt cover staff my with phone profound starting out we're a publisher's computers are on my front one show that was where we made the PR grand pro the others give the real ambulance and better Royce was new and when the opposite news will come to run our I think hold the south as again form it because I've definitely always been right instead of them actually my risk with big gestures put this in my choice of what you're in sees reduced of the radio program there's literally red hair on it the lines come on it in the afternoon that are direct as a raise arm and fixer and then you are you the with hair and civilian yet and I'm really able to for this fucking room all is like but numbers here I think there's a pre-operated shit by millions of versions and the shit where this I'm a host there just to the program. The program doesn't belong to me. If it belongs to someone, it's in that very in